So I'd like to welcome everybody to this session on the 29th of August in 2020. And tonight we look at the Bahai community in Western Australia. I did invite Mehrdad, Meshgin and Minoo Fozdar to take the lead with this, and they have invited in a number of additional Bahais from Western Australia who are either still there or who have left from Western Australia and in different parts of the world. So once again, in this session, we have people online from all around Australia. The country is so large that we've got 3 time zones within the country, and then we've got people from North America and Europe who are online as well. I thought I might just give a few minutes introduction to Western Australia for those who are coming online from overseas. It's quite a large state in the west of this country, a total land area of 2.5 million kilometers. That's 970,000 square miles, very large distance, with a population of something over 2 million, which is a very small population for that land size. But if you look at that map, you see there's quite a lot of desert there. And there's not too many areas that have dense populations of cities and towns. The first inhabitants came 40 to 60,000 years ago, the indigenous Australians who were spread across the land. And the European settlement doesn't start till the 1800s, a relatively recent experience. And this is the vast, unique state that we're going to hear about tonight in terms of the Bahais that are coming from Western Australia. And of course, the Bahais online in Western Australia can fill out anything that's important about what it is to be part of a Bahai community in such a large state territory. Now, let me finish my introduction with just a few notes about the origins of the Bahai community in Western Australia that predate some of the presentations that we're going to have tonight. We know that Claire and Hyde Dunn travelled to Perth in April of 1924 with Effie Baker, and they stayed approximately 5 months. And they were aware that Martha Root was arriving in Australia from China, and she joined them in Perth. And it's well known, part of the Martha Root legend is that she gave 36 talks while she was in Perth. And a local assembly was formed during that time. It was the second following the formation of the local assembly in Melbourne in 1923. I've listed a number of the names of some of those first West Australians who joined the Bahai community. And those stories won't be told in detail tonight, but they will appear in a little more detail in the biography of Claire and Hyde Dunn and in the history of the faith in Australia. But we'll move on tonight because this is just an introduction, an overview of these years. Now, how many times did Claire and Hyde Dunn travel to Western Australia? We know there was another visit in 1927 for 3 months, and again in 1930. But we also know that that first assembly did not survive. Very difficult for those early Bahais to understand exactly what the requirements were for an assembly. And there were many other challenges as well. But we know that in 1936, the Perth Assembly was re-established. And in 1937, indeed, was the first time that the Perth community had elected delegates to the National Convention. But due to resources, the cost of coming across from Perth, they were not able to come to the 1937 convention. We also know then that Martha Root travelled for a second time to Perth in 1939. I've listed there the Bahais in Perth in 1948, a small group, because the NSA letter says to all declared Bahais of Perth and Regional Teaching Committee and there. And some of the long-standing members of the community had become Bahais in the 20s, still there in the 40s, the Webbs and the Millers in particular. And then, of course, the Perth Assembly was re-established in 1949. That was part of what was called a 6-year plan in Australia to re-establish. In 1957, that Perth community was elaborated into a number of other of the first Bahai communities in Western Australia, Subiaco, South Perth. I don't know what Perth Road Board means, but that's listed there in our historical records, and Claremont. So that's an overview of the, in very brief detail, of the Perth community. But we have online tonight, of course, members of the Western Australian community to fill in the detail of that. So I'm going to unshare my screen at that point. And I did invite Minoo and Mehrdad to make a start, to introduce them briefly, and then I'll leave it to them. So first of all, Minoo Fozdar left India in 1954, intending to pioneer to the Cocos Islands, but he ended up in Brunei. He stayed with his family in Brunei for 15 years, working for the state treasury. He came to West Australia roughly 1970, and was spent years in South Perth and then Geraldton and Bunbury. So experience of going into the outer areas and then returning to Perth after 30 years. He lives in Melville. And also Mehrdad Meshgin, who I see online with Nahid as well. Born in Tehran, left as a youth, 1957, went to the United States for his education. He did his training at the University of Mexico. And I nearly said Mexico. I don't know why I said that, Mehrdad, but I always think you've got a Persian Texan accent, so I look forward to hearing it tonight. Now, it says that the family met Dr. Peter Khan at the Bosch Bahai School in California and were encouraged to move to Australia, and they did that in 1981. And since the year since then, Mehrdad and his family have been very active in the Bahai community, in travel teaching in other countries, and also in the administration of the Bahai communities in West Australia. Mehrdad notes that he has been 60 years of service on local assemblies in Iran, United States, and Australia. And of course, for many years was involved in the Association for Bahai Studies, operating in Australia. So Minoo and Mehrdad will also introduce other speakers tonight, John and Iran Milne. We have others, Charlie and Barbara Pierce are online. Bryn Deamer's up in the early hours of the morning in the United States, he's online as well. Minoo, I'm going to hand over to you now for your presentation, and we just look forward to hearing from the West Australian Baha'is tonight. So thank you.
Is that my turn now?
Yes, Minoo, you're on now.
Okay. My name is Minoo Fozdar. I'm one of the participants tonight. My attempts to pioneer overseas started in 1953. When I attended the conference, New Delhi conference, Intercontinental Conference. 5 members of the Fozdar family at that conference volunteered to pioneer. And within a couple of years of that, all 5 had gone to some pioneering post. In 1954, a message came from the Guardian to the National Spiritual Assembly of India saying that Minoo Fozdar should go to Cocos Islands. And so I packed my bags and went off to Singapore on my way to Cocos. In Singapore, I went around with my mother looking for a tent because I had heard that there was no accommodation available and I was going to pitch my tent on Cocos Island and go and live there. The Guardian had been misinformed as to the possibilities of entering Cocos because the island was owned by a person called Clunis Ross. And he was not allowing anybody in or anybody out. So I was stuck in Singapore. Fortunately, my brother was in Brunei and he made it possible for me to enter Brunei as a pioneer. The 3 of the pioneers who entered before me were all named Knights of Baha'u'llah. So I missed out by a few months. Anyway, now Fahad, are you showing the picture of the National Assembly of Brunei? So the activities in Brunei, a lot of people became believers, and local spiritual assemblies were established. And finally, in 1966, I think it was, that the National Spiritual Assembly of Brunei was established. Then I left Brunei. I was working for the Treasury, as Graham said in the introduction, and was awarded a medal by the Sultan of Brunei for my services to the state. Yeah, that's a picture of that. Okay, in 1969, we left Brunei and arrived in Western Australia in January 1970. And at that time, one of the most active believers in the community, there were several of them. I will ask Hugh and Iran Milne to say a few words, and after them, Charlie will tell us of the very early days. You and Iran?
No, Iran first.
Well, I'll tell you about my life. I left Iran back in '56 when Guardian was telling the youth to get out, pioneer, and study. I went to Croydon outside London, did my nursing, and with a couple of other friends. And after that, when I finished nursing, I asked the National Spiritual Assembly of London, where would they like me to go? I was going to do my midwifery. They advised me to go to Scotland. So I went to Scotland, and fortunately, that was back in 61, I went to Scotland. And then Aberdeen, I went to Aberdeen, and then we didn't have an assembly then. But some people came, family came from Canada, and some people came from Edinburgh, couple of Persian girls from different parts of England, and we formed the assembly back in 70. It was 61 or then 63. We formed the assembly, first assembly of Aberdeen. And of course, I was there for a few years, did my midwifery, met Hugh, and Hugh was in Merchant Navy, and first thing, I was too cold and miserable in Australia, in Scotland. We decided to come to Australia, Western Australia. We left Scotland, it was in February.
No, January, 26th of January, yeah. 1964.
1964, we arrived to Perth. It was hot summer.
In February, we arrived.
That's right, that was February. And I was the first Persian to hit Western Australia. So I was very popular with immigration. They used me for interpreting, and there were a few sailors jumping ship, and they called me to interpret them. And then we lived in, first of all, we lived in South Perth. And when the assembly lost 2 members, Mr. and Mrs.
Michael and Ruth
Michael and Ruth Sale. Yes, they left Western Australia. They went to Sydney, and they were short of 2 people in assembly. So we moved to Perth, West Perth, and formed the assembly. From there, when I was about 15 or 16 Bahais there. In whole Western Australia. And then from there, when they had few more Baha'is arriving, we went to Bayswater. We lived in Bayswater and formed assembly back in 70s. formed the Assembly of Bayswater. And then from then, there was lots of friends from Iran coming, other countries coming, and Tahiris came, Mashid and Muluk and Hamid Tahiri arrived, and we moved then to Mandarin. Unfortunately, we formed the Assembly of Mandarin there. So we've had few bounties, and I was in London when Guardian passed on. I had that bounty of, going to Guardian's funeral. Also, I was there when the Congress was on, back in '63. I was a youth then, I was helping around. So I've been very, very lucky to be able to serve the faith. And then we decided to come to Albany, which is wonderful. We have some wonderful Baha'is in Albany. But we miss Baha'is in Perth, of course. And we've had very sweet memories of all the time we were in Perth. And with us, I hand it to. That's it. That's all I have to say. That's,
Well, and when we arrived in Perth, I was given my wife did all the teaching, and I was given the job of cooking, cleaning, and looking after the house. It's been that way ever since. But that's all right. But I'm finished. Oh, there we go.
Here's it.
That's the names of the people were here when we arrived. Well, about the same time. Yeah. You can see that, can you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Hugh. And Iran, yes,
We should ask
and
Charlie.
if you have any memories of some of the people who were listed there, this is the type of session where we would like to know those Baha'is that stand out to you from your first days in Perth. Who do you remember, and what was it about them that sticks in your mind? We would love to hear that.
Well, Mr. and Mrs. Handley, John Handley and Margaret Handley. Margaret was Hand of the Cause, Featherstone, and they were fantastic. They always had firesides, and we had lots of, actually, who was it? Pam Poulters. What's her name?
No.
She used to go to their fireside. There's quite a few Baha'is attended their fireside. And then what else? Otterly used to be fantastic, teaching children. And she had when we arrived, there was a Baha'i center in Outram Street in West Perth, and she was living upstairs, and the hall was, center for any firesides or any meeting we had. Otterly has done a hell of a lot, teaching children, and every one of those Baha'is, they were fantastic. Who else? We had a lady called, that old lady, what was her name? She used to play music. She wasn't a Baha'i, but she used to come, Miss Mehrdad. She used to come to the Baha'i gatherings and play piano. Well, that's all I could remember, really.
Yeah, I think Charlie should.
Charlie.
Charlie.
Yes.
Charlie wants to say something.
Yes, good evening. Aloha everyone. Charlie and Barbara here.
Aloha.
I'm going to tell you my story with photographs. So I'd like to start off with, can you see that one?
Thank you, Charlie. We can see it.
Okay, now this was, can you still see it?
Yes, Charlie, tell us about this this photo, who's in it, why it's important.
Yeah, okay, so this was, if you look on the extreme left, you'll see Hand of the Collis Featherstone, and you'll see his daughter, Margaret, right in the front, carrying, I think it's Justin. John Handley will be able to say. I don't see John in the photograph, but I think he might be just close to Collis. And I want to show you also a few more people. On the front row, on the left, is Tony Deamer. Then there's Hedy Moani. Then Bryn Deamer. Then Barbara Ned. Not my wife, Barbara, another Barbara. Then Margaret. Then Gwen. Then Veronica. And on the extreme right is Tony Barnard, who was a hairdresser. Above Tony is George Street. Next to George Street, I'm moving left now, is Meg Deamer, and she is the mother of Tony and Bryn. I'm not sure who the person is next. Then we have Olive. Then behind her we have Sonny Peterson. Sonny Peterson was one of 9 of us who formed the local spiritual assembly of the Subiaco in 1969. That was the first time it was formed. You can see Iran. Behind her, I think it's Elmer Butterfield. Right in the middle, on the top, is a young man called Mick Cater, being supported by Kevin Croft and myself. We're at the back. But the lady between myself and Kevin is Beth Honeybourne, who came from Albany. She was a lone believer. There was another one called Julie Laurie, but I don't think she's in the photograph. Next to me is Pamela. And then going across towards the left, I don't know the young man next to Pam, but going down towards the bottom is Josephine Spall, then Joy Mansbridge, then Marjorie Edgedi, and then, of course, Hand of the Cause. I'm not sure who they are. I've got another photograph to show you. And I'd like to show you this one, just to show John Handley. John, can you see yourself on the right? This was a gathering of the Bahai youth in Perth.
Oh, Charles, we can't see that second picture yet.
Sorry, I'm sharing it.
Can I suggest you unshare and then share it again?
Now, can you see it?
It's the same one.
Thank you, we can see it now.
Okay, so John Handley's on the right. Right in the front row is Bryn. Bryn is joining us now, so is John. Tony Deamer is, like myself, we went to Vanuatu, New Hebrides. Tony is still there. The person right in the front is called Hedy. Now, you may have heard of Hedy. He is recognized as a martyr of the faith. When he was in New Zealand, he was attacked and killed, and he's recognized by the House of Justice as a martyr of the faith. So I'd like to show a couple more photographs. Going to my supply of photos. I'd like to show you this famous photo. Can you see this one?
Yep.
Yep.
This one was in an international calendar, and it's also in the booklet that's been produced for the bicentenary. This is a group of Bahai youth from Perth in Albany, where we had gone to visit Beth Honeybourne, and it shows you this wonderful bright yellow car called Bahai Unites Mankind that caused a sensation everywhere it went. Tony Deamer, Bryn Deamer, myself, Mick Cater, Kevin Croft in the top right-hand corner. So that's another photograph. Another one to show you, to share with you, is this one of when we, can you see the car, Bahai Unites Mankind, when we use that car for teaching, under the guidance of the first regional teaching committee, most of the youth went out to a number of country towns and tried to time their visits to agricultural shows. So I think we're here in Narrogin and we're setting up a display. That's myself, Tony and Bryn. Helen Gordon was also involved, but I don't think she's with us this evening. Another photograph, and I really want to show this because Hugh Walker is present. I'd like to show you. This was our wedding. We had the first wedding of 2 Baha'is in Western Australia. And this was in 1971. And if you look directly behind Barbara, that is Hugh Walker. Then to his right is Pam, who's passed away now, Kevin Croft, and another very strong Baha'i who was in Perth at this time called Suhail Tahiri, who's also passed away. But just between Barbara and myself is a lady with a big white hat, and she was Alma Butterfield. And she had a most beautiful voice. I believe she was a radio presenter. She was a very remarkable lady who was larger than life. And the person on the extreme left is, again, Mick Cater. And his dad, Wally Cater, was at one stage a member of the local spiritual assembly. I think that's all. I do have a beautiful photograph of Ottilie Strempel here, who she went to pioneer to the New Hebrides in 1969, and she came back in 1970, and I went to take her place. And so this was a photograph at Ottilie's house when she had just come back and I was about to go. Ottilie Strempel was a lecturer at the training college, Teachers Training College in Perth, and she gave up this to pioneer to the New Hebrides, later Vanuatu. So friends, I think that's probably all I'd like to share for the moment. I'll pass back to, unless Barbara wants to say something.
Okay. Barbara, we would love to hear from you. Don't be shy.
Well, I'm very happy, Alawapa. I do not have any photographs to share with you. I was very fortunate to find the Baha'i faith in Perth, coming from Melbourne, and was absolutely stunned by the writings of Baha'u'llah, particularly the proclamation of Baha'u'llah. And when I realized I was a Baha'i, and the Baha'is were so happy, they needed a person to complete the 9th member of the Baha'is of Perth. And I found myself serving on the institution of the local spiritual assembly and being their secretary, not knowing anything about that kind of work. I was teaching small children, primary school children. I went out and bought a typewriter. Very strange. But, and I also remember getting the book that we used to get as new believers and how I used to read it inside out and upside down. And I remember catching the train and buses to visit all the believers, because this is what a secretary did. And it was just so wonderful. I don't think I knew very much when I left a year or so later to go to Vanuatu, but I was extremely glad for the deepening sessions that Suhail Tahiri ran at Helen Gordon's place, where we studied the Kitab-i-Iqan, God Passes By, and a number of other books. I'm very happy to become a Baha'i in Western Australia in 1970. Thank you, everyone.
Can I just say something, Graham?
Please,
it's Helen Gordon. It's Helen.
Hello,
Gordon.
Helen.
Helen, wonderful, Helen.
I just want to say how much I remember the Bahai Unites Mankind cars. We had two, remember? There was a bright green one and a bright yellow one. And I remember when we bought it, it was just a group of us, and Tony Deamer said, he said, don't worry about the engine. If the engine doesn't work, it doesn't matter. Just get one that looks good. It's got to have good upholstery. And so these cars we bought for such a cheap price because Tony would just keep fixing them up. He would do up the engines. And I remember the trip to Narrogin very well. And also, do you remember we used to go down to the Copper Kettle? It was a little cafe in Pinjarra, and us youth, we used to sing. And of course, most of us couldn't sing very well except for Charlie. And Charlie would hold the whole thing together, and we would all join in, and we would go and sing at this little cafe. And then remember that Elmer and Les Harmon, they used to come and listen to us singing there. And then they offered their house for us to have the very first WA Bahai Summer School. Do you remember that?
Yeah, yeah.
And they left their house and went and lived in a tent in the bush, and they let us use their house. We all just slept on the floor, just in the lounge room. We're all next to each other, you know, like there was no room for men or room for women. It was just everyone on the floor. And then we walked down to the little scout hall down the road, and we had our meetings down there. And so I don't know whether you remember all that, but it was quite amazing, because when I became a Bahai, they asked me, can you go back and get a accommodation in the middle of Perth so that we can keep the LSA of Perth going? And that was when Maxine, remember Maxine? Maxine Bradley, who then later pioneered to Bunbury with her husband Jim. But she said to me, do you want to come and flat with me? And it was right in the heart of Perth. So I managed to move in there and keep the LSA going. That was in 1970. So a lot of good memories. And another one was, I remember Hand of the Cause Furiton. I had no idea what a Hand of the Cause was at all, but Hand of the Cause Furiton came, and we decided, because we were going down to Pinjarra, we would have a public meeting down there. And so I remember I had to drive him down, and all the way down, and I thought, oh gosh, this guy, you know, like he's going to be exhausted before we even get there, just chanting all these prayers. I had no idea what, you know, like the significance of Hands of the Cause. They were just, in those days, I just didn't know. And we got there, and it was amazing. There were about 16 Aboriginal people turned up to the meeting. And so it was really, there were a lot of very, very exciting times, really. We did a lot. And Charlie's singing group was amazing, because we used to sing at university and all over the place. And, you know, it was really good. Anyway, okay, that's enough.
Okay. Should I take over, Graham? Thank you very much, Charlie, Iran, and Helen. Have you? I can't seem to get my screen up. But have you got the picture of the photo of the South Pole?
Charlie, can you turn your screen sharing off?
Pardon?
Charlie needs to turn his screen sharing off.
Charlie needs to turn his screen.
I've done it.
One person can share at a time, Charlie. So, yeah, there we go.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. When we came to Western Australia, we were asked by the regional teaching committee to move to South Perth, because South Perth had 7 believers and was about to form its local spiritual assembly. This is an early picture of the 1973 picture of the Baha'is of South Perth, with, of course, the beloved hand of the Collis Featherstone. It is interesting that some of the Baha'is of South Perth were believers from the time of the Duns. And you have Mary Cox here in the middle, and you have Mary Chin just behind her. The rest of them, Mick Cater, you saw in Charlie's pictures. Then there's Wendy Cater, his wife. The Olsons, I will speak about them shortly. Gary, Cy, Kimberly, Pam, she passed away unfortunately. I can't recall who this one is, and of course that's me.
Yes.
So that was the early days. Mary Cox seems to remember that when they became Baha'is, the whole idea of an Eastern faith was frowned upon, and they were in a way ostracized, that people would shun them. They, old friends who would stop conversation with them. So they suffered persecution of a sort. When we arrived, there were a handful of believers. Charlie spoke about the youth. The youth were very active at that time. When the Olsons arrived, things changed dramatically. They had what they call Friday night open house. Now, I don't know how many of the early believers are listening to this, but that really had a great impact on the building a community. Friday nights were open house at Gary and Sai's place. Baha'is and their friends gathered together. And one of the top events of the evening was a game of table tennis. And Baha'is became so fanatical about the way they played their table tennis that inquirers would be forgiven to think that it was a tenet of the Baha'i faith to play table tennis. They were very, very keen, but those Friday nights were very important in building up a rapport among the believers. After them came Betty Fernandez and her daughters. And with them also came the Sundaram girls. These people were all very active believers in Malaya at that time, and had good, very great fireside meetings. There were several declarations from as a result of the firesides at Betty's house. And these were attended by inquirers and by many of the believers. Until 1976, auxiliary board members for Western Australia didn't live in Western Australia. So far as I recall, John Walker was an auxiliary board member, and Western Australia was part of his jurisdiction. And after him, John Davidson became auxiliary board member and looked after the affairs Baha'i Affairs of Western Australia. In 1976, I was appointed, I was the first resident auxiliary board member, and that was in 1976, and I worked in that capacity until 1996, so 20 years as auxiliary board member for Western Australia. I was very fortunate to have worked with two very outstanding women as a role of auxiliary board members. One was Betty Fernandez, who was after I was appointed, she was appointed later as auxiliary board member. And after Betty left, Mani J. Rehani was appointed as auxiliary board member. Both were very dedicated and outstanding and very charismatic persons. The institution of the auxiliary board members owes a great debt to Dr. Peter Khan. He was instrumental in really developing that whole institution. We were all floundering and quite ignorant of what our tasks, what our jobs were. But Peter was able to guide us and educate us in our role. In 1980s, I can't see myself speaking. I don't know what I've got on the screen. In 1980, of course, the great influx of Iranian believers started. So the whole picture of the Baha'i community changed dramatically. Before we had I think just a couple of Iranians, Iran Milne and Sohail Tahiri. But then from 1980s, a large number of Iranians started coming into the state because of the revolution in Iran. The Australian government was very generous and opened the country for Baha'i refugees. They understood that the Baha'is were being persecuted, and they opened the doors for them. The responsibility for then settling believers, we were guided by the National Spiritual Assembly, and the local believers helped in settling the new incomers. And two individuals who were particularly very helpful in settling these people were Parviz Kiani and Sohail Mahanian. They were very helpful, always would go to the airport, receive them, come, take them to the hostel, settle them. So they were very helpful. The National Spiritual Assembly had told the board members to preferably guide these new people to settle in different areas, to be spread around and not to congregate. And so it was the task of the auxiliary board members to guide individuals as to where they should settle. And it is wonderful that many of them followed the advice and settled where they were needed. And one of the examples that I want to mention particularly was the Mehrdats. This was an elderly couple who were materially very well off. I didn't realize that, and nor did Betty, I think she was at the time, realize. And they could have settled in one of the most affluent areas of Perth. But they were asked if they could move to Canning, which is more or less a middle class area, and without any difficulty, they just moved into Canning. So later on, I realized what a wonderful thing they had done. But many of the believers were like that. They moved into areas that Baha'is were needed. We had a national convention in Western Australia, and that was the. Oh, Mehrdad, did you want to say anything about the Persian influx? Mehrdad?
Yeah, you've already referred to it, Minoo, but maybe I will make a couple of points when it gets to it. So
Okay.
you carry on, and then I'll take over after you.
Okay. Okay, we had a national convention, and Farhad, could you show the picture for that? No, that's not the one. The national convention. So that was the only national convention that we've had in Western Australia. Some of you, if you're around, might recognize yourselves. I can see Manijay and Adel Rehani. I can see Mojgan Tosif, Hamid Taheri, others around, yes. Okay. There's David Eddington, Nola White, yeah, Drew and Shelley, Riaz Ali, Mehrdad. Okay, so that was the only time we had a national convention, and that was in 1985. I want to mention, Farhad, now you can put the Aboriginal teacher. There was very active Aboriginal teaching. This just happens to be a photo that I had, and Arman, he's now a doctor working in the Aboriginal medical service. Arman was actually lived in an Aboriginal village for a year, I think, and was very active in teaching the Aboriginal people. Others that I want to mention for Aboriginal teaching was Trevor and Ellie McLean. Trevor and Ellie were instrumental in bringing into the faith the first Aboriginal elder to enter the faith. I think it was Herbert Parker. And they lived, Trevor and Ellie lived in Carnarvon, traveled hundreds and thousands of kilometers to visit Aboriginal areas. And so did Peter and Marjorie Tidman. Marjorie's story is in her book, that on one occasion she was attacked, was stabbed by a person who entered her house in Carnarvon. Faridun Misaq, who in Southeast Asia had been a counselor, came to Western Australia and was very active in teaching the Aboriginal people in Western Australia. The Hand of the Cause of God, Mr. Featherstone visited WA many times. On one occasion, a group of us flew with him, and he flew in a private, in a plane, chartered, and Robin Gibbs was the pilot. And who was it? Yeah, both Mr. and Mrs. Featherstone flew up to the north, went to Broome, Carnarvon, Lagrange, and met several leaders, Paddy Rowe, Jack Mallardy. Then I want to mention Bernie J. Rehani. She was an outstanding auxiliary board member and later became a councillor, and she was the first councillor from Western Australia. And all of you know about her. Many of you met her. Travel teaching was a very active, very important role that the Baha'is played in Western Australia. They would go to small towns, set up little shows in agricultural shows, and teach the faith. One last thing I want to mention is the development of summer schools. Helen mentioned the summer school that she attended, and the one that I remember is a small town in the south, and there were only about 20 people that attended. Nowadays, that there are well over 200 that come to Bahai Summer School. Okay, I will stop there and hand it over to Mehrdad now.
Okay, thank you, Minoo, and thank you, Graham, for organizing this evening. And you did mention that in 1980s, I came to Australia with Nahid and the family. And also you mentioned at the beginning, in 1924, where the Duns and F.E. Baker came here. And now I'd like to just share the extent of the Baha'i community in Western Australia today, that there are 34 functioning assemblies and 3 registered groups with 2,627 Baha'is. So you can see that with the seed which was planted by the Duns, how the faith has grown in Western Australia, this vast state with few people in it, actually. Now, when we came here, as a result of the advice of Dr. Peter Khan, we were in America, and Ruhiya Khanum had gone in 1984 to California and encouraged the Persian friends to leave America and go to other places and settle aside from the United States. And when we heard that, we were contemplating leaving America, although we had lived there many years and we were familiar with the language, the culture, the people. But as a result of the guidance from Dr. Khan, we came to Australia, went to Sydney, and then we found Sydney another big city with high rises and traffic and population. We went to Melbourne, it didn't appeal to us. We went to Adelaide, and then finally we ended up in Perth. And when we got in here and contacted Nahid, and I said, this is the place, so if you can organize and come over. And so we've been here ever since, and we have enjoyed it. And people ask us, do you like Perth? And the answer we give them is, you think if we didn't like it, we would stay here 40 years. So it is really a home for us now. Now, Minoo and the other friends made mention of the contributions of individuals to the Baha'i community of Western Australia. I like to take a little bit of a different approach and look at the contribution of events which has led to the growth, expansion, and recognition of the faith in this state. And it begins with a time that we went to the dedication of temple in Samoa, where the Ruhiya Khanum was representative of the Universal House of Justice at the opening of the temple. And after a few days, when the conference was finished, Dr. Ray Meyer pulled us over and he said that Ruhiya Khanum would like to come from Samoa directly to Perth and visit the Baha'i community. And you are commissioned to go back and make the logistics of her visit. And this was very exciting news for us. So upon return, then with the help of Nahid, we made a few arrangements. We booked the hotel, which was at that time brand new hotel, Milne was the name of the hotel, which later on became Hyatt in the heart of Perth, and made a booking in there and made other logistical arrangements for her arrival. And within a few days, she came to Perth. Now, at that time, Gary Olson, that his name was also mentioned, was working in Ansett Airlines. And we asked him if he could go into the plane and welcome Ruhiya Khanum and Violet Nakhjavani, who was accompanying her. And he organized that. And when she arrived, they brought her out of the plane into the lobby of the airport. And if I can ask Farhad to share the first photograph with us. This is at the lobby of the airport in Perth, where a handful of Baha'is had gathered to welcome her, and from there directly was driven to the hotel. Now, while she was here for a few days, a couple of very important events took place which helped the recognition of the faith in Western Australia. One was a meeting that she had with the governor of Western Australia. And the time allocated for that visit was 20 minutes. So we drove her to Government House, and she went there and had the meeting while we were standing outside. And 20 minutes was finished, and she didn't come out, and 30 minutes, and she wouldn't come out, and 40 minutes, and the secretary went in and told him that you have other appointments, and he said, no, this is an important meeting, I want to continue. But cutting the story short, after it was finished, she came out very excited because she felt that it was a very fruitful meeting with the Governor General of Western Australia. The other part of the event, which also helped the growth of the faith and recognition of the faith, was the interview that she had at the hotel with the reporter of West Australian newspaper. That they came there and they interviewed and they recorded the outcome of the interview in the newspaper the following day. She also met with all the Baha'is of Western Australia in one meeting. And this was the only meeting that we saw all the friends, visible and invisible. Those that we had never seen showed up in that meeting. And it helped the unity of the community at that time. Now, there was one other issue related to her visit, which I asked Nahid to share with you, if you would please.
Yes, Aloha, friends. Yes, when she was here, we would visit her every day and give her rides to different places that she wanted to go. She was looking for a box to put all her treasures from the gifts and souvenir that the chief and the presidents of the different islands that she visited before she come to Perth, and she wanted to give all this in a box and send it to Haifa. and because she had a stop in India and in London before she goes to Haifa. And we couldn't find a box that she wanted. And wherever we went, she said, no, this is not good enough. No, I don't like that. So finally, the final day, she asked me, she said, would you please send this to Haifa for me? Because I couldn't find any box. You find and you send it. And later on, that was I had many sleepless nights because those treasures, I didn't want to get lost. And I was very worried about how I'm going to mail it and how I'm going to do it and then I find out that send it to Israel, there is no insurance. So finally I found somebody, I think it was Mehrdad family in Canberra, that they're from Shiraz. And that family were going to go to pilgrimage. And I asked them if I sent this by ansett to Canberra, and can they take it to Haifa and give it to Ruhi Khanum, and that happened. So I got finally a nice card from Violet saying that we finally received the gifts and everything else. So that was something that happened that was very outstanding for me, that it worried me for a while, but we finally did the job.
Okay, thanks, Nahid. The next event which had quite an effect on the introduction of the faith in Western Australia was the formation or establishment of the New Era Choir. Now, Greg Parker, who was the initiator of this, had an idea which was based on the Martin Luther King speech, I have a dream. And he had a dream. Greg Parker had a dream to form a one-off choir of various nationalities and have a performance on that. And this one-off event happened to be a continuous thing for some 10, 20 years. And they went to different Bahai gatherings, to Bahai, they went to various schools, to various non-Bahai organizations who invited them to go and perform. And virtually a lot of people knew the faith through the performance of New Era Choir. Now, there was one highlight of their performance, which is shown in this photograph here. And I'm going to ask again Nahid to fill you in on that, because she was also involved in that choir at that time.
Greg Parker was such a talented musician. And so he decided once that he wants to put only a play that Abdul Baha wrote, which was it is in one of the Abdul Baha's story of his life at the end of the book. And and he named the play Face of Glory. And we performed in the two different occasions. One was a Murdoch University theater, Nexus, and we had 3 nights performance. And that play was seen by 1,000 people, and mostly non-Baha'is. And it was the story of Abdul Baha telling how it is effective that everybody, hear the kingdom, the call of the kingdom. And it was a beautiful performance. And he wrote these 14 songs, which was all about that play, and also one prayer that Abdul Baha said in that play. So it was a beautiful performance. And then again, 6 months later, we performed again in amphitheater in City Beach. And that was also 3 nights, but then it was too many waiting lists, so we had to perform another night, 4 nights. So it was something that it really echoed in the city. It was really beautiful performance.
Okay, thank you, Nahid. If we take the picture off, Farhad, please. Thank you. In 1997, the Regional Baha'i Council was formed, and it started administering virtually the affairs of the faith in the state. Now, the External Affair Group were quite active to introduce the faith to the wider community. And amongst one of the things that the External Affair Group did was to organize a meeting of the full council at the office of the Premier of Western Australia. And it was not an easy thing because they wanted to have a one-to-one meeting and to offer assistance in any way that the Baha'i community can do to the people of Western Australia. And it is customary that when you go and see the authorities, you usually go and request something. But this was not the case. And after much trial, the office of the Premier of Western Australia, which was Jeff Gallup at the time, they gave a time to the council to go and meet. So the full council of 9 members went there to his office, and he had met him in his office. And the first thing he asked, he had done a study of the faith beforehand, and he said, "What can I do for you?" And at that time, the chairperson of the council said that we haven't come here to ask for anything. We have come here to see what the Baha'i community can do for the betterment of the West Australian society. And at that time, I remember when we went, I was a member of the council, and Padma Wong asked the Premier, "Can we start our meeting with a prayer, as it is customary within the Baha'i gatherings?" And he wholeheartedly welcomed that. And ever since became a very good relationship between the Baha'i community and the officials of the state. Now, right about that time, the institute process was picking up momentum. And as some of you may know, there were 2 cities in the world which were in forefront of institute process. One was Perth in Western Australia, and the other one was Vancouver, Canada. And at that time, because of the development of the Ruhi classes and so on, the National Assembly had made a plan to have physical presence for the Institute in every state. And West Australia was the first one to initiate that. And they acquired a property and built a building, which is the Baha'i Center of Learning in Perth. Now, this center is really a silent teacher because it's located at the place that over 20,000 cars pass by every day, and they see the sign of the Baha'i Center. And so many people over the years have stopped there and asked, what is the purpose of this place? What do the Baha'is do? And they have attended Baha'i gatherings and Baha'i meetings. So it's the greatest silent teacher of Western Australia. Now, this center was opened by it was opened in one evening, and this photograph here shows Verona, who was the MC of the opening evening. And the next photograph, if you show it, Farhad, please. Hello. Oh, yeah. Thank you, Farhad. This photo here shows Fiona MacDonald as the representative of the National Assembly at the opening of the center. Next to Fiona, on the right is the Governor General Sanderson, who gave the opening remark. Next to him is the President Premier of Western Australia, Mark McGowan, who was the opposition leader at the time. And they gave a very wonderful recognition of the work of the Baha'is in the state. Now, Minoo mentioned something about the influx of the Persian believers. You know that after the revolution, many of the Persians went to Pakistan and to Turkey, and they were waiting for a country to take them as religious refugees. Now, in Australia at that time, they did not have a religious refugee status. And I remember Beverly Stafford, who was the Secretary of the National Assembly, once said that she received a phone call from the World Center, and the House of Justice had instructed them to contact the Prime Minister's office and see if they can facilitate the refugee of some of the Baha'is who were strangled in Pakistan and in Turkey. And through the effort of National Assembly, actually, in Australia, they passed the legislation in the parliament to have a new category of religious refugees. And as soon as this was done, which was within a few months, the first group of refugees, religious refugees, of 60 or 70 of them arrived in Perth in one plane travel. And of course, through the assistance of the friends here, they were settled. And as Minoo mentioned earlier, they were encouraged to go to different parts of the state. Now, one of the appreciation that the Australian government had with regards to the settlement of the Baha'i refugees in Australia was that normally when refugees come to this country, they tend to congregate in one place. But contrary to that, when the Baha'is came, they were spread all over the place, and they became integrated into the community. And that was noticed by the government so appreciatively, that the Baha'is are not the one who congregate in one place. They spread, they integrate, they become part of the community at large. And of course, all these refugees came, their children grew up and they married, many of them non-Persians, and now they are really contributing to the welfare and the well-being of Australia as a whole, which is a wonderful contribution that they've had. True that there's been some challenges while they've come here, but then the outcome and the positive outcome of their arrival far exceeds the challenges that the friends experienced here. Now, there is one other matter that I like. We were just running out of time, but I think it's very important to mention another contribution of events in Western Australia, and that is the education, the Baha'i education in public schools. As some of you know, the curriculum was first initiated by Lynn Cooper in Queensland, and the friends in Western Australia quickly picked that and tried to apply it in public schools. And it grew and developed rapidly. And many people who took these classes, who were not Baha'is at the time, they're now grown up and they are officials in various capacities in the state. And many times they make reference to the education and the character training and the virtues that they get from the Baha'i children classes in public schools that they attended. And so that was one of the, I think, great contributions that the Baha'i community had made to the education system in Western Australia. There were a few other incidents which also helped the education. I like to bring, mention this particular painting, which along the education in schools was introduction of the faith by Phil Duncan, who is a painter. And if you remember at the beginning of the Institute process, there was a lot of emphasis on artistic performance. And Phil picked this up and became a famous wall painting artist. And he has been able to do his arts in many schools, in many public areas that they have commissioned him as his profession now. And he uses Baha'i themes in his paintings. In this particular one that you are seeing now is the one that he did last year in one of the schools in Melville, in Mount Pleasant. And the quotation on the right hand top is one of the Baha'i quotes, and the theme of this is a multicultural gathering of people. So this is the way that he uses the Baha'i themes in his paintings and his performances. Another area of education is spiritual parenting, which was initiated by Farah Evans and Nuran Kiani a couple of decades ago, actually, and it's continued. It's still going on. The education of parents when they are raising their children. And this has been welcomed by the wider community. They always have a waiting list of parents who want to participate and go through the training that was established and actually perfected over the years by Farah and her assistants. I think that sort of brings up to the end of our time. I don't think that I should take more time. It might be a couple of questions at the end, so I will just finish now at this time.
Thank you very much to Mehrdad, Nahid, and Minoo, for Farhad for adding the help with the visuals, and to Hugh and Iran Milne. This has been a very special event for us to hear from the West Australian Baha'i community. Obviously, there's much more that we can hear about, and there's so much more to learn about and understand, but we have gained some insight tonight. And it really rejuvenates our spirits to hear your stories. You're such a talented community, such an artistic community, such a vibrant community. And we love to hear what you've achieved over the years. And as you've been speaking, I've been thinking about this fact that it's 100 years of the Baha'i faith in Australia and its living history. We often think of history as in the dim past, that we get it only from books and records, but here we are with people who are part of those stories. And what we're doing in this series is bringing to life, bringing to mind those events that are most significant to us, and then trying to understand why they're significant and what we can learn. So your session tonight has helped us with that process, and everybody has appreciated it greatly. But I do know that there are other Baha'is online from Western Australia, and I would like us to extend just a little longer to invite any of those friends who are online to share some of their thoughts. We could have other sessions in the future, but let's continue for another 10 minutes to invite those friends who are online.
So Graham, if I may share an older photograph.
Go ahead, Bryn.
Thanks so much. This is Bryn Deamer. I became a Baha'i in Perth in 1962. And I thank so much Mehrdad and Minoo for bringing me up to speed on what happened to my home country after I left Australia in 1975. But I have an old photograph here, and I'm going to share it. And perhaps people can help me recognize it. I know John Handley's on the left. My memories of Perth, of course, are completely overlaid by 6 years in the South Pacific in the island of Tanna, and 19 years in Israel, and then 19 years in California. So I left Australia as a young person just out of university. So all of the things you've been talking about since that time has really brought me up to speed with what happened in my home community. But if you can see this image, I believe it's in front of the Outram Street Bahai Centre, which was my grandmother's home, which my mother, my brother and I lived in for many years. And particularly, I want to ask if anybody recognizes who the gentleman kneeling on the right-hand side of, in the dark suit is. My memory, because I was only maybe 8 at the time, would that have been Frank Kahn by any chance?
No, I believe the gentleman, are you talking about the gentleman kneeling down?
Yes, that's great. On the other end from you.
I was going to say it looked like Dr. Mahaja.
Oh, maybe. Okay.
No, it's
You
not.
see John Handley?
No, it's not. There's no chance it's Frank Kahn, and it's not Raja.
No. Okay, all right.
Who is it then?
I think Dr. Mahaja would be very much younger. He's an older man, I think.
Okay. Well, that's good, because I had this. It's one of the few photographs that survived the cyclones and tornadoes and things that we suffered in Vanuatu, New Hebrides. And the little lady in the middle, I believe her name was Gladys Murtagh.
Gladys Murtagh. She was a wonderful person.
That's right. Very sweet. And of course, your children and wife and everyone down here. And John.
Yes, that's Mariette next to Margaret. She lived in there in Perth for a while.
Okay. Right. Sweet. And now I just want to go back to another photograph. I'll skip over this one quickly. Oops, a mention was made of this couple.
The Ajedis.
Yeah, and they were my after.
So
Eddie
his
Marley.
family.
Yeah. Right.
His family, yes.
Yeah. They helped us so much as the first deep and he being English, and she was married to the Persian gentleman, and I remember many deepenings at their house where they helped us understand the writings in so much greater depth, because as youth we used to just read the writings and just that's nice, and then we would go back on the same book and they would be able to explain the Persian philosophy, the Rumi, Rumi, and it was amazing. It just made it so much more depth. So that was pretty wonderful. So my association with the Bahai community in Perth basically came to an end in 1975. So everything happened after that. So it was news to me. But my mother did go to Bunbury in 1964. So many of the photographs that we saw earlier from Charlie were actually in front of my house in 5 Open Road, City Beach. They were, my mother bought that house in 1962. She had first heard of the Bahai faith in Sydney in 1961 and went back to Perth to tell it to her family, but they weren't very interested. And my memory as an 8-year-old boy is that she was in a room of Baha'is and they were bemoaning the fact that they didn't have 9 people so they could reform the local assembly. And she looked around and said, but there are 9 of us. And they said, are you a Baha'i? And I said, well, yes, I am. So she became a 9th member of the local assembly of 62. Again, as an 8-year-old child's memory. And then in 64, we went to Bunbury and she was married to a gentleman and we lived in a town called Waterloo outside of Bunbury. And then that marriage broke up. In 67, she went back to Bunbury so she could take part in the 1967 centenary of Baha'u'llah's proclamation of the kings and rulers of the world. And she spent the time putting advertisements in the local Bunbury newspaper. And then John Handley, thank God, was a little angel from heaven. He helped my brother get out of a bad situation where he was about to lose his mechanical apprenticeship due to illegal activities of the company he was working for, and gave us good advice. And we moved back to Perth as a family so that my brother could transfer his apprenticeship back to Perth. So that survived. And as you heard the stories about the old cars, and there are many photographs of those old cars around. And you're right, there were two of them. There was a Ford Cortina, 1955 Ford Cortina, and 1957 Morris Isis, for what it's worth. So that was basically it for Perth. In 1975, I went, my brother and I joined Tony, who had joined Charlie in New Hebrides. And then we weren't allowed to stay, but Tony could. So my mother and I came back to Hunters Hill in Sydney. And then my life moved on. Went back to Perth, went back to Vanuatu, 1983, out to Haifa, 2002, I've ended up in California. In a nutshell, so I'm just so glad to catch up with what with the Institute, hear about the Institute process, hear about how the Baha'i faith has progressed from that one local assembly when I was a child to, what did you say, 36, 37 active local assemblies now. It is fantastic. And I appreciate being here so much and having my memories jogged, my childhood memories jogged. Thank you all.
Bryn, before you go, that photograph that you put up and you asked who the gentleman was, the gentleman that is kneeling down on the front, right on the right-hand side, is the father of Izzat Rameshni here in Brisbane. I can't remember his name now, but somebody remember his name?
Mehrdad Jamshidi.
Yes, yes.
Mr. Jamshidi.
Mr. Jamshidi, yes. Now,
Jamshidi.
he came and stayed with us in Perth, and that must have been in 1968, after he had been to the conference in Sydney. And I believe that house, this one, and I'm not sure, but the fence looks like the fence of the house where Ottilie Strimple lived. That's
right, yeah. Yeah. That's Effie Vinton in the middle. That's Margaret Mangan on the left side. Margaret Handley, myself, and those kids are there. Merrill Handley and Soraya Min.
John, if you're referring to the house that I lived in, when that was the Baha'i Centre, that was my grandmother's house. That
in West Perth,
26 Outram Street.
Yes, yeah. 26 Outram Street.
Right. And upstairs, my mother and I, Tony and I, lived there as children with my grandmother, and then she rented the house to the Baha'is, and we made it the Baha'i Centre for some years. So yeah, that would have been at 26 Outram Street.
Well, I never knew it was your grandmother's house.
Yeah, there we go. You learn something every day.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that, John. You're becoming our resident historian, John. Thank you for that. I can see Fiona and Keith online, and Rita and Rod are online, and Ian McFarlane's online. Verona's online. Alan Major's online.
Yes, look, I'd like to fill a few stories in about the 1960s in Perth, because the 1960s was quite a period of development in Western Australia. It was a very, very young community, and it was a very dynamic community. And there was lots and lots of declarations in a period of about 4 or 5 years. And we have a lot of people online here that can testify to that, and all the activity that went on. We had in the later 60s with Charlie's help and Bryn's help and Mick Cater and Verona and a number of other people. There was great teaching activity, and I don't know whether any of the other friends with there, Verona. I see Verona there, whether they'd like to comment about that. But that was a period of interest. And one of the other things that happened, which Helen might tell a little story about, is that in 1967, when we were asked to make presidents to the governors, to the premiers and the clergy for the proclamation of Baha'u'llah, we made a proclamation to the premier, and my recollections are correct. Helen's father was the secretary to the premier, who facilitated us meeting with the premier. Is that correct, Helen? Maybe she's gone. Do you recall, Verona?
Yeah, Helen and I met at university, and I knocked on your door in 1967 to ask if I could find out more about the Baha'i faith. And it was then I became a Baha'i at the end of that year, and the next year, 68, we started the youth group and the youth firesides. And it was those youth firesides which brought Charlie and Pam and Fiona into the faith and that activity. And I left for Sydney about that time. But Helen's father was, as you said, he was secretary to the premier. Yes. And he would have facilitated that. But the curious thing is that Helen didn't come into the faith for another year or two after she came into the faith in Sydney one after she came to spend a holiday with me, and I beer bashed her the whole way. She came into the faith. So our friendship predated the faith, and she stayed on to provided huge services, the faith in Western Australia, and I dashed off and ended up in Fiji. So that's the story. But our children, David, Ronald and Andrew, all spent time in Perth, and of course Ronald's still there in Western Australia. David was very much involved in the music with all that, the choirs and everything like that. So our family has been very mixed up, and of course my mother still sits there having passed 101. So that's quite a long contribution to the faith.
And I'd like to refer back to a photo that Minoo put up there of the assembly in South Perth in 1973. And he mentioned Mary Cox and Betty Bunny. Now, Mary Cox and Betty Bunny were the two daughters of the first Bahai in Western Australia, and I think it was 1927 or 28, Annie Miller. And she was the first Bahai in Western Australia, and they were her daughters. Yes, the two right in the middle, one standing on behind the other, both with glasses. The one at the top was Mary Cox, and the one at the bottom was Betty Bunny. And they were the daughters of Annie Miller.
She was Miller. Mary Chin was Miller.
Mary Chin, yes.
Yes, Mary Chin was Miller.
Mary Chin, sorry, and Betty Bunny, yes.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah, she was Miller.
Yeah, you're right. And,
okay, John. Thanks for that, John. Was there anything else you wanted to say about that assembly? I just wanted to check and see who else might have something else to share before we finish. But you were referring to that photo. Was there anything else about that photo that you wanted to share with us?
No, it was just about those two ladies being the daughters of the first Bahai in Western Australia. That was the only reason for that.
Well, I do appreciate that, because this shows how we need to find out more about these first Baha'is in the community, more about their life stories. So thank you for highlighting that.
Graham, could I just make just one quick comment?
Well, of course, Fiona. That's why I was trying to get to you and Keith so that we could hear from you. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry I joined a bit late. We had a RIM, Regional Institutional meeting all day, so I was able to join a bit later. But really just to make comment that I was, as John had said, the first house I ever went to as to a fireside was to John Handley's house, invited by Charlie Pierce, who worked with Pam Porter.
Yes.
At Verona. So all of those, and of course, you know, to me, it made so much sense when I heard about the Baha'i faith that I saw myself as a Baha'i when I first heard about it, until Charlie said to me one day, a couple of months later, when somebody asked me in front of him, was I a Baha'i? And I said, yes, I suppose I am. And he said, no, you have to declare. Nobody told you in those days you had to declare. And then Verona put me through the Will and Testament of Abdul Baha. So I have a lot to be grateful for all those dear souls for my spiritual journey.
And we had quite a contingent from England at that time, because there was also Wendy and Pam and also Adam Thorne. Adam Thorne, you can't forget him.
Yeah. Yes, actually, Wendy and Pam became Baha'is in Melbourne a few months later, and then we all went back to the UK. And unfortunately, Wendy died at age 39. Yes. Pam died at age 53, and Adam died last year at 72. So really, really quite sad that we lost all those friends, but they're working hard, I'm sure, in the next.
Keith is there as well, and look, I just don't know what to do, because I want to keep going for another hour or two, but we can't do that. And Diana, I was going to ask you if you're online, and you were mentioning about your mother. So Diana, are you still with us online? Maybe you can give that story.
Yes, I am still here. My mother learned about the faith when in South Australia, in Adelaide. And she met my father there. He taught her the faith because his grandmother was a Baha'i. And but she didn't become a Baha'i at the time. She thought she was, but nobody asked her if she wanted to sign in with you or join. So they moved to Western Australia, and my dad got a position to study at the University of Western Australia, and it was there in Perth that she declared that someone said, you know, and she said, I thought I was a Baha'i, because she didn't know she had to sign a card or anything. So anyway, that took place in 1949, and she married my dad there, and she had 3 children, and then we all moved to Canberra, and I believe she may have been one of the first Baha'is in Canberra. I think we'd have to check on that one, the date.
She will also be spoken of when we have the session on the ACT. Mm-hmm. And so thank you for that.
Yeah, there's a picture of us, my mum and us children, hanging on the wall in the Baha'i Centre in Canberra, saying that she was the first Baha'i in Canberra. So, yeah.
Well, thanks for that. Sorry I put you on the spot. So friends, we'll come down to the last couple of minutes, and I just want to check if there's any other contributions to come tonight before we bring it to a close.
Just one more, Graham, and this is more for your sake. Just before we left Perth in 1969, we finally got our hands on all the old records of Annie Miller. And they eventually found their way to the National Archives, I believe, through Collis, because it was given to Collis, and he gave it to the National Archives. But in amongst that, there was 11 letters from Shoghi Effendi, and there was all sorts of historical records about Perth. I don't know whether you've seen them or not.
John, thank you for that. Margaret Anderson, are you still online? Do you remember the Miller papers? I was going to note that a number of the letters of Shoghi Effendi to Annie Miller appear in Messages to the Antipodes. But I'm sorry to put you on the spot there, but if you've got anything, any thoughts on that, the Miller papers.
No.
Margaret's just responding now.
It's difficult, but there was a folder of stuff came that had letters in that were from Perth. At the time, I couldn't do anything with them, but they're there in the archives. It could be those.
Okay, well, thank you for that, and John, thank you for that. I will follow up on that, friends. I think we must bring this to a close now. So I want to thank all of our contributors tonight to this session. On behalf of everybody who's been online tonight, thank you. You can see everybody's clapping and giving their warmest praise in the chat. Thank you so much to our West Australian friends.
Thank you, Graham.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Good night.
Lovely.